In the middle decades of the 19th century, as Kansas City shifted from a muddy river outpost into an emerging commercial hub of the American interior, the idea of permanence began to matter in ways it never had before. And this desire for permanence expressed itself not only in rail lines and warehouses, but in architecture meant to announce civic ambition. And Corinthian Hall emerged from this moment as a structure designed to project confidence, order, and cultural seriousness in a city still negotiating its identity at the edge of the frontier. And when the hall was first conceived, Kansas City was defined as much by motion as by settlement, with steamboats along the Missouri River, wagon traffic heading west, and railroads tightening their grip on regional trade. And amid this churn, local leaders sought a building that could function as a shared civic space, a place where commerce, politics, entertainment, and public life could converge under a single roof. And Corinthian Hall was intended to serve that role, not merely as a venue, but as a statement that Kansas City had arrived as a city capable of sustaining refined public institutions. And its very name, invoking classical architecture and European tradition, reflected a deliberate effort to align the city with older centers of culture and authority rather than with the raw improvisation of frontier towns. And the choice of a Corinthian aesthetic was not accidental, as classical references carried connotations of stability, democracy, and intellectual legitimacy, qualities local elites were eager to associate with their rapidly growing city. And when construction began, the hall stood out sharply against its surroundings, rising above nearby structures that were still largely utilitarian in design. And its presence signaled an aspiration to create a shared civic identity that transcended individual businesses or families. And from the beginning, Corinthian Hall was envisioned as a multi-purpose building, capable of adapting to the changing needs of the city. And this adaptability was essential in a place where economic cycles could shift quickly and public priorities were still being defined. And early uses of the hall reflected this flexibility, with spaces configured to host political meetings, lectures, musical performances, exhibitions, and large public gatherings, all of which were essential components of civic life in a growing city. And these events played a crucial role in shaping Kansas City's public culture, providing forums where ideas could be exchanged, and where residents could experience a sense of collective participation beyond the routines of work and commerce. And the hall quickly became associated with moments of visibility and importance, hosting figures who brought national attention and lending the city a sense of inclusion in broader American conversations. And this visibility mattered deeply to a city competing with regional rivals for investment, population, and prestige. And Corinthian Hall functioned as both stage and symbol in that competition, projecting an image of Kansas City as organized, ambitious, and culturally engaged. And yet beneath this aspirational exterior, the hall existed within a city marked by sharp contrasts, including economic inequality, political factionalism, and the lingering tensions of a nation still grappling with the aftermath of civil conflict. And events held within Corinthian Hall often reflected these tensions, as political debates and public meetings exposed disagreements about labor, development, and governance. And the hall thus became not only a place of unity, but also a space where conflict could be aired within a structured environment, reinforcing the idea that civic order required both expression and containment. And as Kansas City expanded through the late 19th century, the role of Corinthian Hall evolved alongside it, adapting to shifts in population, technology, and public expectation. And the rise of new forms of entertainment and communication began to change how people gathered and what they expected from public spaces. And the hall responded by hosting increasingly diverse events, including theatrical performances, traveling shows, and exhibitions that reflected national trends while also catering to local tastes. And this responsiveness helped maintain the hall's relevance even as newer venues emerged. And its central location ensured that it remained embedded in the daily life of the city, accessible to a broad cross-section of residents. and the building's interior became a familiar environment for many Kansans, associated with moments of excitement, persuasion, celebration, and sometimes controversy. And over time, these accumulated experiences layered the hall with meaning beyond its architectural form, turning it into a repository of shared memory. And yet Corinthian Hall was never immune to the pressures that shaped urban life, including financial strain, competition from newer structures, and the constant need for maintenance in a climate that could be unforgiving to 19th century construction. And decisions about renovation, repurposing, or replacement reflected broader debates about progress and preservation, with some viewing the hall as an outdated relic, and others seeing it as an essential link to the city's formative years. And these debates were not merely aesthetic, but economic and ideological, touching on questions of who the city was for and how its history should be valued. And as Kansas City entered the 20th century, these questions grew more urgent, as rapid growth and modernization threatened to erase earlier layers of the urban landscape, and Corinthian Hall stood at the center of this tension, embodying both the ambition that had built the city and the fragility of structures that depended on collective will for their survival. And while the hall continued to function as a public venue, its role was increasingly shaped by external forces beyond the control of its original builders, including shifts in entertainment technology, changes in transportation patterns, and the emergence of new civic institutions that competed for attention and resources. And yet, even as its prominence fluctuated, Corinthian Hall retained a symbolic weight rooted in its origins, representing a moment when Kansas City consciously chose to define itself through shared space and public ritual. And this symbolic function persisted even as practical considerations altered how the building was used. And in this sense, the hall's early history cannot be separated from the broader story of Kansas City's transformation from frontier settlement to urban center. Because the building both reflected and influenced that transformation, shaping how residents understood their city and their place within it. And the story of Corinthian Hall in its earliest years is therefore not simply about bricks and mortar, but about aspiration, identity, and the belief that architecture could help impose order and meaning on a rapidly changing environment. And as the city continued to grow and change, the fate of the hall would remain closely tied to how Kansas City negotiated the balance between memory and momentum, a negotiation that would define the building's later chapters and ultimately determine how it would be remembered long after its original purpose had faded. As Corinthian Hall settled into its role as one of Kansas City's most recognizable civic interiors, the city around it accelerated in ways that tested every assumption built into the structure's original purpose. And by the late 19th century, Kansas City was no longer simply trying to prove it belonged among American cities. It was actively competing to dominate the economic and cultural life of the region. And this competition reshaped how public spaces were used, valued, and contested. And Corinthian Hall found itself increasingly at the center of that transformation, not because it was new, but because it was already trusted as a place where large numbers of people could gather with the expectation that something important was about to happen. And as railroads multiplied and stockyards expanded, the population surged with newcomers who brought different expectations, political views, and cultural habits. And the hall became one of the few shared environments where these differences collided in real time, and political rallies held inside the hall grew louder and more polarized, reflecting the rise of machine politics, labor agitation, and debates over regulation, tariffs, and municipal power. And the acoustics that once carried polite lectures now amplified fiery speeches meant to mobilize voters and intimidate opponents. And this shift altered the emotional character of the space, transforming it from a venue of aspiration into one of confrontation. And yet this confrontation was itself a sign of maturity. Because cities without civic arenas rarely argued in public, and Corinthian Hall allowed conflict to unfold within walls designed for order, even when order was strained. And beyond politics, The hall's role in entertainment expanded dramatically as traveling performers, lecturers, and novelty acts moved along increasingly efficient rail networks, bringing national culture into the city at a pace previously unimaginable. And the hall hosted concerts, dramatic performances, illusionists, and exhibitions that exposed residents to trends shaping urban life elsewhere. And for many attendees, these events represented their first direct encounter with ideas and performances that originated far beyond Missouri. And this exposure reinforced Kansas City's growing sense of itself as a connected, modern place rather than a peripheral one. And the hall's management adapted constantly, reconfiguring seating, lighting, and scheduling to meet changing demands. And this adaptability kept the building relevant even as newer venues appeared, because Corinthian Hall had something they lacked, a reputation built through repetition, memory, and habit, and people knew where it was, how to get there, and what it felt like to be inside, and that familiarity mattered in a city still sorting itself out. And yet success brought strain, and the building's heavy use accelerated wear on its structure and interiors, forcing ongoing repairs that were expensive and often deferred. And debates over funding revealed fractures between private owners, civic boosters, and city officials, each of whom viewed the hall through a different lens, as an investment, a public necessity, or an aging liability. And these debates mirrored broader arguments about who was responsible for maintaining shared spaces in a rapidly privatizing urban economy. And while the hall continued to generate revenue through events, it increasingly relied on the assumption that it was indispensable, an assumption that would later be tested as tastes and technologies evolved. And during this period, Corinthian Hall also became entangled in moments of crisis, including public meetings held in response to economic downturns, labor disputes, and civic emergencies. And these gatherings reinforced the hall's role as a place where the city confronted itself, where fear, anger, and uncertainty were given physical form through crowded rooms and raised voices, and the emotional weight of these moments lingered, shaping how the space was perceived even when it hosted lighter fare. And the hall's walls absorbed these experiences without distinction, holding debates, celebrations, and confrontations side by side. And as the 19th century drew toward its close, Kansas City's skyline began to change, with taller buildings, electric lighting, and new forms of transportation altering how people moved through and perceived the city. And Corinthian Hall, once visually dominant, now competed with newer structures that reflected different priorities, including efficiency, scale, and profit. And this competition forced a reevaluation of the hall's identity, because it could no longer rely on novelty or architectural distinction alone, and instead its value rested increasingly on its symbolic status as a civic anchor, a place that had witnessed the city's rise and continued to host its most consequential gatherings. And this symbolic value was both an asset and a vulnerability, because symbols depend on collective agreement. And as the population diversified and expanded, not everyone shared the same attachment to older institutions, and younger residents in particular were drawn to newer venues that promised comfort, spectacle, or exclusivity, and Corinthian Hall responded by broadening its programming, attempting to remain inclusive while still asserting its importance. And this balancing act defined the hall's late 19th century existence, as it navigated between tradition and adaptation without fully committing to either. And by the time the city crossed into the 20th century, Corinthian Hall stood as a building shaped less by its original design than by the cumulative pressure of decades of use, debate, and reinvention. And its future would depend not on what it had been built to do, but on how well it could continue to absorb the city's changing needs without losing the meaning that had made it matter in the first place. A challenge that would grow more severe as Kansas City entered an era of modernization that left little patience for structures that could not justify their presence in purely economic terms. As the 20th century began to assert its influence over Kansas City, Corinthian Hall entered a period defined by pressure rather than optimism, as forces well beyond the control of its original vision reshaped the way cities functioned. and how public space was valued, and what had once been a proud emblem of civic maturity now faced an environment that rewarded efficiency, novelty, and specialization over multi-purpose tradition. And Kansas City's growth during this era was explosive. Driven by industrial expansion, meatpacking, rail consolidation, and an increasingly complex political machine that thrived on control rather than consensus. And within this atmosphere, Corinthian Hall continued to operate, but its role became more reactive than generative, responding to changes rather than setting the tone for them. And new theaters, auditoriums, and commercial entertainment venues began to emerge, many of them purpose-built for specific functions, offering better sightlines. Improved acoustics, electric lighting, and modern amenities that Corinthian Hall struggled to match without extensive and costly alterations. And while the hall still hosted important events, it increasingly did so in competition with spaces that represented the future rather than the past. And this competition exposed the limits of adaptability in a structure conceived for an earlier urban rhythm. And yet the hall did not disappear from public life, because it still occupied a psychological position that newer buildings could not immediately claim, having accumulated decades of shared experience that gave it a credibility difficult to replicate. And civic organizations, fraternal groups, reform movements, and political factions continued to rely on the hall as a neutral ground, a place where legitimacy could be borrowed from history even as new agendas were advanced. And this reliance reinforced the hall's status as a civic commons at a time when many public spaces were becoming more fragmented and exclusive. And during periods of economic instability, including the financial panics that punctuated the early 20th century, Corinthian Hall once again served as a gathering place for public meetings, speeches, and organizing efforts, reflecting its enduring function as a container for collective anxiety and response. And these gatherings often revealed the growing divide between different classes and interest groups within the city, as labor organizers, business leaders, and political operatives vied for influence, sometimes within the same walls that had once hosted genteel lectures and concerts, and the tone of events shifted accordingly, with rhetoric becoming sharper and stakes more explicit. And the hall's interior, worn by years of heavy use, bore witness to these changes, its physical aging mirroring the social tensions playing out inside, and maintenance became a constant concern, as deferred repairs accumulated, and the cost of modernization loomed larger than ever, and discussions about renovation frequently stalled due to disagreements over funding, ownership, and long-term viability. And these debates highlighted a growing reluctance to invest in older civic infrastructure unless it could be justified through immediate economic return, a standard Corinthian Hall increasingly struggled to meet. And at the same time, the rise of motion pictures and mass entertainment began to reshape public expectations, drawing audiences toward venues designed for passive consumption rather than participatory engagement. And this shift undermined one of Corinthian Hall's core strengths, its flexibility as a space for live, communal experience. And while the hall attempted to accommodate these new forms by hosting screenings and hybrid events, it was never fully optimized for them, and its scale and layout, once advantages, now appeared inefficient in a market driven by throughput and repeatability. And yet, even as attendance fluctuated, the hall retained symbolic significance for those who viewed it as a marker of Kansas City's formative decades, and preservation sentiment began to surface, not yet organized or influential, but present as an undercurrent in discussions about the city's future. And this sentiment clashed with a prevailing belief that progress required replacement rather than adaptation. And the hall became a testing ground for this ideological conflict, representing a choice between continuity and reinvention that the city would face repeatedly in the decades to come. And as political power in Kansas City consolidated under increasingly centralized control, the use of Corinthian Hall for overt political purposes declined somewhat, replaced by more controlled venues aligned with dominant interests. And this marginalization reduced the hall's visibility while also insulating it from some of the more aggressive dynamics shaping municipal governance. And in this quieter role, the hall hosted community events, educational programs, and smaller-scale gatherings that maintained its relevance without commanding the same attention as in earlier years. And this period of relative modesty allowed the building to persist even as larger structures rose around it, altering the urban fabric and shifting the center of gravity away from the hall's immediate surroundings. And the neighborhood itself evolved, shaped by changes in transportation, commercial patterns, and demographic movement. And as foot traffic shifted and businesses relocated, Corinthian Hall found itself less centrally embedded in daily urban life. And this spatial marginalization compounded its challenges, making it harder to sustain regular use and justify investment. And yet the hall's survival through this era was not accidental, but the result of accumulated decisions to defer final judgment, to keep the building in service rather than declare it obsolete. And this hesitation reflected an unresolved tension between reverence for the past and impatience with anything that appeared to slow progress. And by the 1920s, as Kansas City entered a period of both cultural vibrancy and political entrenchment, Corinthian Hall stood as a structure suspended between identities, no longer the unquestioned center of civic life, but not yet dismissed as expendable, and its continued operation depended increasingly on its ability to absorb changing uses without collapsing under the weight of expectation or neglect. And this precarious balance would define the hall's next phase, as external pressures intensified and the city's appetite for older institutions continued to wane, setting the stage for decisions that would ultimately determine whether Corinthian Hall could remain part of Kansas City's story or fade into memory as a casualty of relentless modernization. By the time Kansas City moved deeper into the interwar years, Corinthian Hall existed in a state of uneasy persistence, still standing and still used, but increasingly disconnected from the forces driving the city forward. And this disconnect was not sudden or dramatic, but gradual and bureaucratic, the result of countless small decisions that prioritized speed, profit, and control over continuity. And during this period, the city's physical landscape changed more aggressively than at any previous time, with new roads cutting through older districts, automobiles reshaping traffic patterns, and commercial development favoring buildings that could be easily adapted or replaced. And Corinthian Hall, rooted in an earlier logic of permanence and civic symbolism, struggled to assert its relevance in an environment that no longer rewarded those qualities. And yet the building did not fall silent, because it continued to serve organizations and groups that had few alternatives, including civic clubs, reform associations, educational initiatives, and cultural groups operating outside the dominant commercial entertainment circuits. And this quieter use gave the hall a different kind of importance, transforming it into a refuge for forms of public life that were increasingly marginalized elsewhere. And lectures, debates, and community events persisted, even as attendance fluctuated and resources tightened. And this persistence created a subtle but meaningful shift in the hall's identity, from centerpiece to shelter, from symbol of ambition to container of continuity. And this shift mattered because it allowed Corinthian Hall to remain embedded in the city's social fabric even as its visibility declined, and during periods of national crisis, including economic instability and political uncertainty. The hall once again became a site of collective reckoning, hosting meetings that addressed unemployment, reform, and relief efforts. And these gatherings reinforced the building's historical role as a place where the city confronted challenges collectively rather than individually. And yet the tone of these events reflected a diminished sense of agency, as speakers and attendees alike were increasingly aware that decisions affecting their lives were being made elsewhere, by distant institutions and centralized authorities, and this awareness infused the hall with a quieter, heavier atmosphere, shaped by realism rather than optimism. And maintenance challenges intensified during this era, as limited funding forced prioritization of basic safety over restoration or modernization, and the hall's interior continued to age visibly, with worn finishes and outdated systems that contrasted sharply with newer buildings rising across the city. And this contrast fueled debates about whether the hall represented heritage worth preserving or inefficiency best eliminated, and these debates were often framed in economic terms, reducing the building's value to square footage and potential revenue, rather than considering its accumulated social significance. And as municipal planning became more technocratic, with emphasis on zoning, traffic flow, and land use efficiency, Corinthian Hall's mixed-use character appeared increasingly inconvenient, and its flexible but non-specialized design conflicted with a planning philosophy that favored clear functional separation. And this mismatch left the hall vulnerable to reclassification as underutilized or obsolete, even as it continued to host meaningful activity, and ownership and governance issues further complicated its situation. As responsibility for upkeep and programming was fragmented among stakeholders with differing priorities and limited incentives to invest long-term, and this fragmentation mirrored broader patterns in urban governance, where public interest was often diffused across layers of authority, making decisive action difficult unless driven by profit or crisis. And despite these challenges, Corinthian Hall endured through a combination of inertia and attachment. Because while few were willing to champion it aggressively, many were reluctant to see it disappear, and this ambivalence allowed the building to survive without resolving the underlying question of its future. And during the cultural shifts of the 1930s and 1940s, when mass media further altered how people consumed information and entertainment, the hall's role continued to narrow, focusing more on local, participatory events rather than spectacles designed for large, anonymous audiences. And this narrowing preserved a core function even as scale diminished, and the building's presence took on a more understated form of relevance, serving those who still believed in the value of gathering face-to-face in shared space. And this belief, though less dominant than before, sustained the hall through years when many comparable structures were demolished or radically altered. And as wartime mobilization and post-war planning began to reshape Kansas City once again, Corinthian Hall stood at a crossroads. Physically intact but conceptually adrift, its survival depended not on its original promise, but on whether a new rationale could be articulated for its existence. And this unresolved status set the stage for more consequential decisions in the decades to follow, as pressures to modernize intensified and patience for ambiguity grew thinner, forcing the city to eventually decide whether Corinthian Hall was a resource to be reimagined or an obstacle to be removed. As the post-war era reshaped Kansas City with renewed intensity, Corinthian Hall entered what would become one of the most consequential periods of its existence, not because it suddenly regained prominence, but because the forces acting against it became too strong to ignore, and the optimism that followed the end of the Second World War translated into aggressive urban renewal programs, infrastructure expansion, and a widespread belief that older buildings represented inefficiency rather than inheritance. And within this mindset, structures like Corinthian Hall were increasingly viewed as relics occupying valuable land rather than as assets contributing to civic life, and city planners, developers, and political leaders began to speak a shared language of progress defined by clearance, modernization, and measurable economic output. And this language left little room for buildings whose value was primarily social or historical. And as highways carved through established neighborhoods and commercial districts were reconfigured to accommodate automobiles rather than pedestrians, the spatial logic that had once supported Corinthian Hall eroded further, isolating it from the flow of daily activity that sustained its earlier relevance. And foot traffic declined, surrounding businesses shifted or disappeared, and the hall's location, once central, now felt peripheral within a reorganized urban grid. And this physical marginalization compounded the hall's symbolic vulnerability, making it easier to argue that it no longer served a meaningful purpose. And during this period, proposals emerged that treated the hall as a problem to be solved rather than a resource to be cultivated, and discussions of demolition, repurposing, or replacement surfaced with increasing frequency, often framed as pragmatic responses to fiscal constraints and planning priorities. And those who argued for preservation struggled to articulate their case in terms that resonated with decision-makers focused on efficiency and growth metrics, because the benefits of continuity, memory, and shared identity were difficult to quantify. And yet resistance persisted, not as a unified movement, but as a series of objections raised by community members, historians, and civic organizations who recognized the hall's role in shaping Kansas City's public life. And these objections slowed but did not halt the momentum toward change, creating a prolonged period of uncertainty during which the hall continued to operate under increasingly constrained conditions, and programming became sporadic, maintenance minimal, and long-term planning nearly non-existent, as few were willing to invest in a building whose future was perpetually in question. And this uncertainty became self-reinforcing, as declining investment led to visible deterioration, which in turn strengthened arguments that the hall was beyond saving, and the building's aging fabric was increasingly cited as evidence of proof rather than consequence. And during this time, broader cultural shifts further undermined the hall's position, as suburbanization drew population and resources away from the urban core, reducing demand for large centralized gathering spaces and private venues, shopping centers. And broadcast media replaced many of the functions Corinthian Hall had once performed, offering convenience and controlled environments that appealed to a post-war public oriented toward comfort and predictability. And the hall's open, flexible, and communal character now seemed out of step with these preferences, and even those who valued its history often struggled to imagine how it could be integrated into the city's future without significant compromise. And as municipal budgets tightened and redevelopment pressures mounted, the hall's fate increasingly depended on political calculations rather than cultural judgment, and decisions about its survival were weighed against competing priorities such as housing, transportation, and commercial development, all of which promised clearer returns. And in this environment, the hall's defenders were often forced into a defensive posture, arguing not for what the building could become, but for why it should not yet be destroyed, and this reactive stance limited their ability to shape outcomes proactively. And yet the very persistence of debate revealed that Corinthian Hall still mattered, because truly irrelevant buildings rarely inspire prolonged argument, and the hall's continued presence functioned as a reminder that cities are not only collections of functions but accumulations of meaning. And this reminder, though increasingly faint, prevented the hall from being erased without acknowledgement. And as the city moved toward more decisive action in the latter half of the 20th century, Corinthian Hall stood as a test case for how Kansas City would treat the physical remnants of its formative years, whether it would absorb them into a renewed civic identity or discard them in pursuit of a cleaner, more streamlined vision of progress. And the outcome of this test would shape not only the hall's future, but the city's relationship with its own past. As Kansas City pressed further into the mid-20th century, the unresolved status of Corinthian Hall began to harden into something more precarious, as ambiguity gave way to impatience and long-standing tolerance for inefficiency eroded under mounting financial and political pressure. And the city's leadership increasingly embraced redevelopment as a tool not just for growth, but for control, using clearance projects to reshape neighborhoods, redirect economic activity, and consolidate authority. And within this framework, older structures that resisted easy classification became liabilities, and Corinthian Hall, with its layered history and diffuse ownership interests, fit uncomfortably into a planning culture that favored decisive, centralized action. And while the hall continued to host occasional events, its calendar grew thinner, and its presence in the public imagination faded, not through a single dramatic failure, but through gradual absence. as fewer residents encountered it in their daily lives, and this fading visibility proved more damaging than overt opposition, because it reduced the emotional investment required to defend the building when concrete proposals for redevelopment finally emerged. And during this period, studies and reports began to circulate that evaluated the hall purely in terms of structural integrity, land value, and compliance with modern codes. And these documents often stripped away decades of social meaning in favor of technical assessments that framed the building as outdated and inefficient. And while these assessments were not inaccurate, they were incomplete, and their dominance in decision-making reflected a broader shift in how cities justified change, privileging data and forecasts over memory and experience, and efforts to counter this narrative struggled to gain traction. In part because preservation advocacy had not yet developed the organizational strength or legal tools necessary to challenge redevelopment agendas effectively, and without formal protections in place, Corinthian Hall remained vulnerable to decisions made behind closed doors, where political expediency often outweighed public consultation, and as the city's priorities aligned increasingly with attracting investment and projecting modernity. Tolerance for structures that symbolized an earlier civic philosophy diminished, and the hall's mixed-use flexibility, once its defining strength, now appeared unfocused and inefficient compared to single-purpose facilities designed for specific revenue streams, and even proposals to adapt the building to new uses faced skepticism, as the cost of renovation was framed as unjustifiable when compared to new construction. And this cost comparison rarely accounted for the cultural loss implicit in demolition, treating history as an optional luxury rather than an integral component of urban identity. And during this period, the surrounding area continued to change, with redevelopment projects altering traffic patterns, land use, and population density, further isolating the hall from the networks that had sustained it, and as nearby landmarks disappeared or were transformed. Corinthian Hall lost contextual support, becoming a lone survivor of an earlier streetscape rather than part of a coherent historical district. And this isolation made it easier to imagine its removal without acknowledging the cumulative erasure it represented. And internally, the building's condition continued to deteriorate, as limited maintenance addressed only immediate safety concerns rather than long-term preservation. And visible decay reinforced the perception that the hall was beyond saving, even though this decay was largely the result of prolonged neglect rather than inherent failure. And this circular logic, where neglect justified demolition and demolition discouraged investment, defined the hall's predicament, and public awareness of the situation remained uneven, with some residents expressing concern when rumors of demolition surfaced, while others viewed the hall as an unfamiliar name detached from their lived experience of the city, and this uneven awareness weakened collective response, preventing the formation of a unified public stance. And as political momentum built toward decisive action, Corinthian Hall's fate increasingly appeared to hinge not on its historical significance but on timing, budgets, and shifting priorities. And the longer a final decision was delayed, the more inevitable loss seemed, not because it was desired, but because alternatives required imagination and commitment that the prevailing climate discouraged. And in this way, the hall became a casualty not of hostility, but of indifference shaped by structural incentives. And as Kansas City approached a point where redevelopment plans could no longer accommodate uncertainty, Corinthian Hall stood as a quiet reminder of a civic model rooted in shared space and public deliberation, a model increasingly at odds with a city reorganizing itself around efficiency, scale, and private interest. And the coming years would force a reckoning, determining whether that reminder would be preserved as a living element of the city or erased as an inconvenience to progress. As the decades advanced and redevelopment pressures intensified, Corinthian Hall entered a phase where its fate shifted from abstract debate to tangible threat. And this transition was marked less by public spectacle than by administrative process, as decisions affecting the building increasingly occurred within planning offices, budget meetings, and policy documents rather than open forums. And this procedural momentum proved difficult to counter because it framed change as inevitable rather than optional. And within this environment, Corinthian Hall was gradually reduced from a civic landmark to a line item, its worth calculated through projections and cost-benefit analyses that left little room for intangible value. And while occasional public notices and hearings acknowledged the building's existence, they rarely conveyed the full implications of its potential loss. And this muted presentation limited the ability of concerned citizens to mobilize effectively. And those who attempted to raise alarms often found themselves speaking a language of memory and identity, in a system that responded primarily to metrics and schedules. And during this period, redevelopment plans targeting the surrounding area gained traction, proposing new commercial and infrastructural projects designed to reposition Kansas City as a modern regional hub. And within these plans, Corinthian Hall appeared as an obstacle, occupying land needed for streamlined layouts and standardized construction, and its irregular presence complicated designs optimized for efficiency, making its removal seem not only acceptable but necessary to achieve broader goals. And the argument that progress required sacrifice was repeated frequently, often without specifying why certain sacrifices were chosen over others. And the Hall's vulnerability stemmed in part from its inability to generate a constituency large enough to outweigh competing interests. And as fewer people interacted with the building directly, fewer felt compelled to defend it. And this erosion of everyday connection proved decisive, because preservation relies as much on lived familiarity as on historical awareness. And without regular use, Corinthian Hall became easier to imagine as expendable. And internal assessments continued to emphasize deferred maintenance, code compliance challenges, and adaptation costs, reinforcing a narrative of inevitability, and even proposals that suggested partial preservation or adaptive reuse struggled to gain support, as they conflicted with redevelopment timelines and introduced uncertainty into projects seeking rapid approval. And the political climate favored clarity and momentum over deliberation. And this preference disadvantaged structures like Corinthian Hall that demanded nuanced consideration. And as negotiations progressed, the building's defenders were often forced into reactive positions, responding to plans already advanced rather than shaping them from the outset. And this reactive posture limited their influence, as opposition framed late in the process was more easily dismissed as obstructionist rather than constructive. And despite these challenges, moments of resistance did occur, including public statements, historical documentation efforts, and appeals to civic pride. And these efforts briefly reintroduced the Hall into public conversation, reminding some residents of its role in the city's formation. And yet these reminders struggled to compete with promises of economic revitalization and modernization, especially in a city eager to redefine itself amid regional competition. And the framing of redevelopment as progress versus stagnation left little room for alternative visions that integrated preservation into growth. And as a result, the Hall's narrative was increasingly defined by what it lacked rather than what it represented. And this deficit-focused framing narrowed the range of acceptable outcomes, steering discussions toward removal rather than reinvention. And the emotional impact of this process on those invested in the building was significant, as they witnessed the gradual erosion of a space that had once embodied collective ambition. And this erosion was experienced not as a single loss, but as a prolonged diminishment, stretching over years of uncertainty and incremental concession. And by the time formal decisions approached, the Hall's survival appeared unlikely, not because its significance had been disproven, but because the systems governing urban change were ill-equipped to accommodate meaning that could not be translated into immediate economic return. And Corinthian Hall thus became emblematic of a broader pattern affecting many historic structures during this era, where survival depended less on intrinsic value than on alignment with prevailing development models. And as Kansas City moved closer to implementing plans that would irrevocably alter the landscape, the hall stood as a silent witness to the narrowing of civic imagination, its presence a reminder of an earlier belief that shared spaces mattered enough to be built for permanence, even as that belief lost institutional support in a city increasingly defined by speed, scale, and replacement. As the final stages of decision-making unfolded, Corinthian Hall's long period of uncertainty gave way to a more somber clarity, as plans that had once circulated as possibilities began to solidify into commitments. And this shift altered the emotional landscape surrounding the building, replacing anxious hope with a more resigned form of awareness. And the mechanisms that enabled this transition were largely procedural, involving approvals, funding allocations, and project timelines that advanced with little public visibility. And by the time broader awareness caught up, many of the critical choices had already been made, and this lag between process and perception limited opportunities for meaningful intervention. And those who had followed the hall's situation closely recognized that the conversation was no longer about whether change would occur, but about how quickly and with how little disruption. And this recognition carried a sense of inevitability shaped by years of incremental erosion. And during this period, official narratives emphasized modernization, efficiency, and economic opportunity, presenting redevelopment as a necessary step toward a more competitive and functional city. And within these narratives, Corinthian Hall was often described in neutral or technical terms, its history condensed into a brief acknowledgement before attention shifted to future benefits. And this rhetorical framing minimized emotional response, encouraging acceptance rather than debate. And for many residents, the hall's disappearance appeared as one more adjustment in a city accustomed to constant change, especially amid ongoing urban renewal efforts that had already transformed familiar neighborhoods. And this normalization of loss dulled the impact of any single removal, making it harder to mobilize around preservation when so much else had already been altered or erased. And yet for those who understood the hall's role in shaping Kansas City's civic culture, the impending loss carried deeper significance, representing not only the removal of a building, but the closure of a chapter defined by shared public life and participatory engagement. And this awareness fueled last efforts to document the hall's history, capture its architectural details, and preserve records of its use, creating an archive that could outlast the structure itself. And these documentation efforts reflected a shift from preservation in place to preservation in memory, acknowledging the limits of influence while still asserting the building's importance. And within this context, debates about value took on a different tone, focusing less on economic justification and more on what kind of city Kansas City wanted to remember itself as having been. And while these debates did not alter outcomes, they revealed underlying tensions about identity and continuity that redevelopment discourse often obscured. And the hall's physical condition continued to be cited as justification for removal, with deterioration presented as evidence of obsolescence rather than as a symptom of prolonged neglect. And this narrative allowed responsibility for loss to be diffused across time rather than assigned to specific decisions, making it easier for institutions to proceed without reckoning. And as timelines advanced, the hall's remaining functions were gradually wound down, events relocated, and access restricted, further reducing its presence in everyday life and reinforcing the sense that its era had already ended. And this gradual withdrawal softened the eventual impact of final action, transforming what might have been a sudden rupture into a prolonged fading. And yet this process also denied the city a moment of collective reflection, dispersing grief and awareness rather than concentrating them. And the whole story thus approached its turning point quietly, marked by paperwork rather than ceremony. And in this quietness lay a powerful commentary on how cities often lose their most meaningful spaces, not through dramatic confrontation, but through procedural momentum that frames disappearance as administrative necessity. And as Corinthian Hall stood on the threshold of irreversible change, its presence became almost spectral, a structure still visible but already consigned to the past, embodying the tension between memory and motion that defines urban transformation. And the next phase would force Kansas City to confront the consequences of choices made incrementally over decades. As the physical erasure of the hall translated abstract planning decisions into tangible loss. When the final actions surrounding Corinthian Hall began to take place, they unfolded with a sense of procedural finality that contrasted sharply with the building's long and layered role in the life of the city. And this contrast underscored how thoroughly the hall had been reclassified from a civic presence to a logistical concern, and the steps that led to its physical removal were framed as routine operations, involving contractors, schedules, and safety measures rather than public deliberation. And this framing reinforced the idea that the outcome was not a choice but a conclusion, the inevitable result of forces set in motion long before. And as activity around the site increased, the hall briefly re-entered public awareness, not as a venue or meeting place, but as an object of transition. And for some residents this reappearance sparked reflection, as the visibility of machinery and barriers prompted memories of events attended, causes debated, and moments shared within its walls. And these individual recollections revealed the extent to which the hall had been woven into personal histories, even if its broader significance had faded from collective consciousness. And this reemergence of memory stood in tension with official narratives that emphasized efficiency and forward movement, creating a quiet dissonance between lived experience and institutional language. And the act of dismantling the hall was methodical rather than dramatic, proceeding in stages that mirrored the bureaucratic process that had preceded it. And as sections of the building were removed, the architectural features that had once symbolized permanence were reduced to materials, stripped of context and meaning by the mechanics of removal. And this transformation illustrated how easily symbolic structures can be rendered ordinary when their narratives are no longer actively maintained. And documentation efforts intensified during this period, as historians, archivists, and former users sought to capture what could still be preserved through photographs, drawings, and written accounts. And these efforts served both as acts of resistance and acceptance, acknowledging loss while asserting that the hall's significance could not be entirely erased. And the resulting records became surrogates for the physical space, carrying forward traces of its influence into archives and memory, and public response remained uneven, with some viewing the removal as overdue and others experiencing it as a quiet shock. And this divided reaction reflected broader differences in how communities relate to change, history, and the built environment. And the absence of a unified response underscored how thoroughly the hall's role as a gathering place had diminished, as there was no longer a single audience to convene around its fate. And as the structure disappeared piece by piece, the surrounding landscape opened in ways that revealed how much the hall had anchored its immediate environment, and its absence altered sightlines, movement patterns, and spatial perception, creating a sense of dislocation that extended beyond the site itself. And this physical change made abstract planning decisions tangible, forcing the city to confront the reality of what had been removed in exchange for projected benefits. And for those involved in the redevelopment process, the completion of removal marked a milestone, clearing the way for new construction and signaling progress within institutional metrics. And yet for others, the cleared space felt unresolved, its emptiness carrying the weight of accumulated memory without a corresponding sense of replacement. And this ambiguity highlighted a fundamental tension in urban change, where removal often precedes understanding, and consequences are felt long after decisions are finalized. And Corinthian Hall's disappearance thus became both an endpoint and a beginning, closing a chapter in Kansas City's civic history, while opening questions about how future generations would interpret the absence of spaces once central to public life. And the hall's legacy, no longer anchored in physical form, began to exist primarily through recollection, documentation, and the subtle influence it exerted on debates about preservation and redevelopment that followed. shaping conversations even as the structure itself vanished from the city's landscape. In the period that followed the physical removal of Corinthian Hall, Kansas City entered a phase of adjustment in which the absence of the building gradually became normalized, even as its influence continued to surface in unexpected ways. And this normalization did not occur through collective agreement, but through routine, as daily patterns of movement and use adapted to the changed landscape. And over time, the site where the hall once stood was absorbed into the city's evolving fabric. Its former presence recalled less through direct experience than through stories, photographs, and the occasional mention in historical accounts. And this shift from lived reality to mediated memory marked a significant transformation in how the hall functioned within civic consciousness. And yet the loss did not pass without consequence, as debates surrounding redevelopment increasingly referenced Corinthian Hall as a point of comparison, using its removal as either a cautionary example or a justification for similar actions elsewhere. And in this way, the hall continued to shape discourse even in absence, influencing how the city evaluated the trade-offs between preservation and progress. And as new construction advanced on or near the former site, the contrast between old and new became a focal point for reflection, highlighting differences in scale, material, and purpose that revealed broader changes in architectural priorities and civic values. And for some observers, this contrast reinforced a sense of discontinuity, suggesting that something intangible had been lost alongside the physical structure, while for others it represented renewal and opportunity, aligning with narratives of modernization and economic growth. And this divergence in interpretation underscored the subjective nature of urban memory, where the same event can generate opposing meanings depending on perspective and experience. And educational institutions, historical societies, and local media began to incorporate Corinthian Hall into broader narratives about the city's development, situating its story within a continuum of change rather than treating it as an isolated incident. And this contextualization allowed the hall's history to inform discussions about planning practices, governance, and community engagement, offering lessons drawn from its rise, use, and disappearance. And these lessons often centered on the importance of early intervention, public involvement, and the recognition of cultural value before structures reach points of crisis. And in this sense, the hall's legacy became instructive, shaping approaches to preservation and redevelopment that emerged in subsequent years. And individuals who had interacted with the building in different capacities continued to share memories, contributing to an informal oral history that complemented official records. And these personal accounts preserved nuances of experience that formal documentation could not capture, such as the atmosphere of gatherings, the sound of voices within its walls, and the sense of belonging it once fostered. And as time passed, these memories acquired a reflective quality, often framed through nostalgia or critical reassessment. And this reflective process allowed the hall to remain present in collective imagination, even as physical traces disappeared. And the city's evolving identity incorporated this layered history, acknowledging both the ambition that created Corinthian Hall and the forces that led to its removal. And this dual acknowledgement complicated simplistic narratives of progress, introducing a more nuanced understanding of growth that recognized loss as an inherent component. And as Kansas City continued to change, the story of Corinthian Hall served as a reference point for evaluating how decisions made in one era resonate across generations, reminding residents and planners alike that buildings are not merely structures but repositories of social meaning, and that their removal reshapes not only space but memory. And in this way, the hall's influence persisted, not as a physical presence but as an enduring element of the city's historical consciousness, informing how future choices might balance efficiency with remembrance and development with continuity. In the years following the removal of Corinthian Hall, the city of Kansas City began to grapple with the long-term implications of its absence. And these implications extended beyond the immediate physical space into questions of civic identity, collective memory, and the management of heritage. And while new developments occupied the former site, their presence served as a constant reminder of what had once been. Contrasting contemporary priorities with the architectural ambition and social purpose embodied by the Hall. And in this context, debates about urban planning increasingly reference the Hall as both a cautionary tale and a benchmark, illustrating how decisions made without sufficient attention to historical significance could lead to the erasure of communal touchstones. And preservationists began to cite its story in advocating for protective measures elsewhere, arguing that early intervention, legal frameworks, and community engagement were essential to prevent repetition of the loss Corinthian Hall represented. And these discussions contributed to the evolution of municipal policies, influencing zoning, redevelopment review processes, and the creation of historical commissions, even as the Hall itself no longer occupied physical space. And scholars and historians undertook detailed studies of the building's architecture, interior design, and role in civic life, documenting its contributions to Kansas City's cultural and social development. And these studies provided a resource for understanding the interplay between urban growth and historical preservation, highlighting how structures serve as both practical facilities and repositories of collective experience. And through exhibitions, publications, and lectures, the memory of Corinthian Hall was disseminated, reaching audiences who had never encountered the building firsthand, yet who could engage with its significance through mediated experience. And this dissemination broadened the Hall's impact, extending its presence beyond immediate geography and time. And in parallel, former residents and participants in its programming contributed to oral histories that captured everyday experiences, social rituals, and public gatherings that formal architectural studies could not convey, preserving the texture of life that had once animated the Hall. And these narratives emphasized the Hall's role as a social nucleus, demonstrating that its value extended far beyond aesthetics or land utility. And as Kansas City continued to develop, planners and architects increasingly recognized that the lessons of Corinthian Hall encompassed more than just preservation. They highlighted the need to integrate memory, identity, and flexibility into urban design, acknowledging that buildings are not inert objects but active participants in shaping social interaction, community cohesion, and civic perception. And this understanding influenced approaches to subsequent redevelopment projects, where consideration of historical continuity became a factor alongside economic and logistical concerns. And in many ways, Corinthian Hall became a reference point for reconciling competing priorities, illustrating the costs of neglect and the importance of proactive stewardship. And although the Hall's physical structure was gone, its imprint persisted in the ways the city approached decision-making, emphasizing that the absence of tangible heritage can exert influence equal to or greater than the presence of intact structures. And as civic consciousness matured, the story of Corinthian Hall was integrated into broader narratives about urban evolution, technological advancement, and cultural adaptation, demonstrating how single buildings can encapsulate broader social currents, economic pressures, and political decisions. And this integration reinforced the idea that understanding the past is essential to shaping responsible and sustainable urban futures. And in this respect, Corinthian Hall remained a potent symbol, reminding the city that the spaces it creates and the choices it makes reverberate far beyond immediate utility, shaping identity, memory, and the sense of place for generations that follow. As the story of Corinthian Hall reached its final phase, the city of Kansas City faced the challenge of reconciling memory with transformation. And in this reconciliation, the Hall's legacy assumed a form less tangible than brick or stone, but no less influential. And over time, urban historians, civic planners, and residents began to recognize that the building's disappearance had created not a void in daily life alone, but a space for reflection on the city's evolving identity. And in this reflective process, Corinthian Hall emerged as a symbol of the complex interplay between ambition, civic purpose, and the forces of modernization, and its story became central to understanding how cities negotiate the tension between preserving cultural heritage and pursuing economic or infrastructural progress. And the lessons derived from its history were incorporated into policies that sought to prevent future erasures of socially and historically significant spaces, with preservation frameworks increasingly emphasizing early assessment, legal protection, and community involvement. And these frameworks were informed by the detailed archival work, photographic records, and oral histories collected before and during the building's removal, which preserved the richness of its architectural features, social function, and cultural meaning. And by maintaining this documentation, Kansas City created a resource not just for historians, but for citizens seeking to understand the broader consequences of urban change. And as new buildings rose in the spaces once occupied by Corinthian Hall, their presence was inevitably contextualized by absence, shaping the way planners, architects, and the public thought about density, use, and continuity. And this contextualization highlighted how the memory of a lost structure could exert influence over new development, guiding decisions about scale, design, and function. And in educational settings, the whole story became a case study in civic stewardship, demonstrating that the value of buildings cannot be reduced solely to economic metrics, but must also account for their capacity to foster community, embody identity, and anchor collective memory. And in parallel, cultural programs, exhibitions, and public lectures used Corinthian Hall as a touchstone to explore the human dimensions of urban evolution, showing that the city's history is constructed not only through surviving architecture, but also through the choices made about what to preserve, adapt, or remove. And these programs reinforce the understanding that preservation is as much about social engagement as it is about physical protection. And in neighborhoods affected by the hall's absence, residents reflected on the ways its presence had structured social interaction, spatial perception, and local identity. And these reflections informed grassroots efforts to advocate for historic conservation in other parts of the city, creating a network of awareness and activism that extended the hall's influence into ongoing urban planning debates, and scholars examining the building's architectural style, interior layout, and decorative programs noted how Corinthian Hall had embodied broader trends in design, social aspiration, and civic vision, providing insight into the aspirations of the city's leaders, the values of its citizens, and the technological possibilities of its era. And this scholarly attention ensured that even in absence, the building continued to shape understanding of Kansas City's cultural and social trajectory. And as decades passed, the hall's legacy was further reinforced by its role in shaping collective imagination, appearing in memoirs, documentaries, and historical analyses as a symbol of ambition, community, and the fragility of built memory. And through these mediated representations, Corinthian Hall retained a presence that physical removal could not fully erase, influencing perceptions of civic space, urban identity, and the responsibilities of planning. And ultimately, the story of Corinthian Hall concluded not with a single dramatic event, but through the cumulative effect of decades of decision-making, adaptation, and reflection, demonstrating that the life of a building extends beyond its material existence into the ongoing narratives it generates, the policies it influences, and the memories it sustains. And in this final sense, Corinthian Hall's impact persisted as a lesson for Kansas City and for urban environments everywhere. That the spaces we construct, inhabit, and sometimes lose are never merely objects, but active participants in shaping who we are, how we relate to one another, and how we remember the city itself.